Daria kept glancing at the fuel gauge as her car crawled forward outside St. Petersburg. The line barely moved. The tank was almost dry. In one of the biggest oil powers on Earth, a driver near Russia's second city was no longer sure she could even reach a pump. That is the moment people inside Russia are starting to understand. This is no longer a faraway war seen only on a map. It is reaching gas stations, freight yards, grain fields, and military roads. And once that happens, the question changes from who is advancing to who can still keep a country moving. The headline says mass collapse. The deeper story is even more dangerous, because when fuel grows scarce, trucks slow down, farms fall behind, rail costs jump, and armies start paying more for every kilometer they travel. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many Russians now feel that control is slipping, and why the image of 150,000 trucks paralyzed spreads so fast. Not because one clean number explains everything, but because the system underneath Russia's road network is being hit from several directions at once. That is what makes this story so explosive. The first thing to understand is that Russia is not running out of crude oil. It is running into a refining crisis. There's a huge difference. A country can pump enormous amounts of oil from the ground and still fail to deliver enough gasoline and diesel to the places that need it. That is exactly where the pressure is building now. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has changed the shape of the war. Instead of only trying to hurt Russian forces near the front, Kiev has spent months reaching deep into the industrial machinery that keeps the Russian state functioning. Refineries became the target, not symbolically, practically. If fuel output falls, the pain spreads everywhere. That strategy matters because refined fuel is what actually powers the system. Cars do not run on crude oil. Freight trucks do not run on crude oil. Combines in the grain fields do not run on crude oil. Trains, generators, supply vehicles, and military tankers all depend on fuel that has to be processed first. Hit the refineries, and you hit the bloodstream. At various points during the campaign, reporting indicated that large sections of Russian refining capacity had been knocked offline or forced into reduced output. That did not mean every refinery stopped at once. It meant enough disruption happened often enough that gasoline and diesel production came under visible stress. And once production slips, queues begin to appear fast. That is why the scenes near St. Petersburg mattered so much. They shattered the image that shortages were limited to distant regions or occupied territories. This was happening near one of Russia's most important urban centers. A line at a pump may sound small, but politically, it is a warning flare. Ordinary people notice shortages before governments do. And once people notice, fear spreads faster than fuel can. Drivers start topping up early. Small businesses buy more than they need. Farmers hoard diesel if they can find it. Freight firms start calling every contact they have. Rumors move from phone to phone. Soon the shortage is no longer only physical, it becomes psychological too. That is where the real damage starts. A fuel system under pressure can survive tight supply if everyone stays calm. But once the public loses trust, behavior changes. People no longer buy for today. They buy against tomorrow. That accelerates the strain. Lines get longer. Tempers get shorter. The shortage begins feeding itself. And Russia is not a small country that can easily reroute supply with a few quick fixes. It stretches across vast distances. Fuel has to move by rail, road, and storage networks over immense territory. Any serious disruption at the refining stage becomes a logistical nightmare when it is spread across dozens of regions with different needs and priorities. The Kremlin knows this. That is why public acknowledgments of the problem matter. Moscow does not like admitting domestic weakness, especially in wartime. So when top officials begin speaking openly about queues, shortages, or supply instability, it usually means the issue has become too visible to deny. Silence is safer when a crisis is still containable. But this one did not stay hidden. Reports from multiple regions described stations rationing sales, motorists waiting for hours, and businesses struggling to secure enough fuel for normal operations. In some places, drivers searched from station to station. In others, the fuel existed, but only certain grades were available. Either way, daily life became harder. That matters because shortages are not judged by official charts. They are judged by lived experience. A woman waiting with an empty tank, a driver who wastes half a day chasing diesel, a farmer who loses work time during harvest, a trucker who cannot finish a route. Those are the moments that convince people something is going wrong. Then came the second layer of the crisis. This was not just about civilian discomfort, it was about freight. Russia's economy depends on moving goods over long distances. If the trucking sector becomes slower, more expensive, or less predictable, the damage ripples outward. Deliveries slip, costs rise, inventories tighten, pressure builds. In places far from the original shortage. That is why the claim about trucks caught so much attention. The exact figure attached to dramatic headlines is not always easy to verify, but the wider reality behind the headline is clear enough. Large numbers of trucks have faced delays, longer refueling times, rising costs, and growing uncertainty. In practice, that can feel like paralysis, even without one single count. And that feeling is deadly for confidence. A logistics network does not need every truck to stop moving in order to suffer. It only needs enough friction added at enough points for the whole machine to slow down. 10 more minutes here, 3 more hours there, a missed delivery, a canceled route, a driver refusing a dangerous corridor. That brings us to one of the most important shifts in this war. Ukraine is not only trying to destroy fuel production, it is also trying to break the roads that move supply to where it matters most. This is a campaign against motion itself, against the idea that Russia can keep feeding both the front and the home front without strain. Nowhere is that more visible than on the routes tied to Crimea and the southern front. These roads are not just commercial highways. They are supply arteries. Food, fuel, spare parts, ammunition, civilian goods, and military support all move along them. When drones begin hunting traffic on those roads, the cost of every delivery suddenly jumps. Russian military commentators have spoken with unusual bluntness about how dangerous some of these routes have become. Roads once treated as rear area lifelines are now exposed. Drivers are forced to think twice. Operators have to weigh profit against survival. Local authorities begin restricting movement, and the map that looked safe on paper becomes dangerous in practice. That change is hard to reverse once it sets in, because the road itself may still exist, but confidence in the road disappears. A truck can be repaired, a bridge can be patched, but a route that acquires a reputation as a kill zone changes behavior far beyond the exact strike site. Some drivers avoid it, others demand more money. That is exactly what began happening. Higher hazard pay became necessary to convince civilian drivers to take fuel into risky areas. And when pay triples in a matter of days, that tells you something simple and brutal. People with direct skin in the game believe the danger is real. Markets can lie. Fear usually does not. The problem for Moscow is that fear on supply routes acts like a hidden tax. Every shipment costs more. Every contract becomes harder to fill. Every delay makes planning less reliable. And when a military depends on constant flow, unpredictability becomes its own weapon. You do not need to destroy every truck. You only need to poison the road. Then came agriculture. This is where the story moves from dramatic to deeply strategic. Russia's grain sector is not a side note. It is one of the pillars of the country's export image and one of the few areas where Moscow still likes to present itself as indispensable to the wider world. Grain is money, influence, and prestige. Harvest season runs on timing. A field cannot wait politely for politics to settle down. Crops ripen when they ripen. If combines do not move, if diesel does not arrive, if machinery sits idle for even a few key days, losses begin. Yield can fall, quality can drop, contracts become harder to meet, and a national strength starts looking fragile. That is why reports from farming regions were so alarming. Some operators described waiting through the night for diesel deliveries just to make sure the next day's work could happen. Imagine what that means. A major agricultural power with full fields ready to harvest, but farmers forced into the same logic as desperate motorists, hunting fuel instead of doing their jobs. This is how wars spread beyond the battlefield, not only through ruins and explosions, but through time lost, through one missed harvest window, through machinery standing still under a summer sky, through the quiet panic of people who know nature will not give them another chance. A refinery strike hundreds of kilometers away suddenly reaches a wheat field, and once farming is touched, the political meaning grows. Fuel shortages in cities create anger. Fuel shortages in agricultural heartlands create fear about supply, exports, and national competence. A government can survive long lines in one region more easily than it can survive the impression that basic strategic sectors are becoming unreliable at the same time. But the strain did not stop on the roads or in the fields. It reached the rail system too. That is a massive warning sign because Russia's freight structure depends heavily on rail linked with private industrial spurs and local diesel-powered operations. If diesel becomes more expensive or harder to secure there, the impact extends far beyond passenger inconvenience. Many outsiders picture Russian rail as one giant, seamless state machine. In reality, cargo flows through layers of connected infrastructure. Factories, mines, depots, and industrial sites often depend on smaller access networks before freight ever reaches the main lines. If those feeder systems face diesel stress, the entire freight chain feels it. Bottlenecks start before trains even roll. That is why rising diesel prices for rail-related operators were such a serious development. Once the fuel bill surges, these companies either absorb huge losses or pass costs onward. Neither option is painless. If they absorb the hit, their own operations weaken. If they pass it on, coal, metals, chemicals, and military-related cargo all get more expensive. And because so much freight depends on those links, this is not just another business story. It is part of the same broader pattern. Russia is discovering that a fuel problem is never just a fuel problem. It becomes a transport problem, then an industrial problem, then an agricultural problem, then a military problem, then a political problem. That chain reaction is the real story behind the collapse narrative. Not one giant dramatic freeze frame, but layer upon layer of slowdown. A giant country can survive one disruption. It can even survive two. What becomes dangerous is when shortages, attacks, risk premiums, and delivery delays start landing in the same season across sectors that matter most. And while civilians were waiting in lines, military planners were dealing with something even harsher. Ukrainian forces were not only targeting the system that makes fuel, they were also targeting the vehicles that move it and the trucks that carry supply toward the front. That created a second crisis running parallel to the first. Less fuel and fewer vehicles to deliver it. This is where the pressure on Russian logistics becomes hard to ignore. When truck losses rise sharply over several months, replacement becomes a problem of math, not morale. You can call up patriotism. You can pressure factories. You can shift procurement. But if losses stay high enough for long enough, the numbers begin making decisions for you. And the numbers being discussed by analysts were striking. Reports described thousands of Russian vehicles and fuel tankers lost over short periods, with some days showing extremely high destruction rates. Even allowing for the fog of war and the reality that military reporting can carry propaganda value, the trend line itself was the issue. Losses appeared to be rising, not stabilizing. That matters because vehicles are not abstract inventory. They are the connectors of war. A shell in a depot is useless if no truck brings it forward. Fuel in a reserve tank means nothing if no tanker reaches the unit that needs it. Logistics wins or loses time. Time wins or loses battles. And there was another ugly detail here. Russia may still have old vehicles in storage, but stored trucks are not the same as ready trucks. Many have sat for years. Some may be repairable. Others may be little more than rusted frames and stripped parts. Pulling from reserve sounds easy until mechanics begin opening doors and seeing what is really left. That is why comparisons with earlier Russian reliance on older Soviet-era armor matter. Once a state begins dragging old hardware from storage to offset current battlefield losses, it signals something deeper than a temporary inconvenience. It suggests replacement pipelines are under pressure. The war is consuming assets faster than the system can comfortably regenerate them. If that same pattern is now reaching the truck fleet, the meaning is huge. Tanks attract headlines because they look dramatic. Trucks often do not. But armies can limp along with older armor more easily than they can function without reliable transport. Trucks move men, fuel, food, repair parts, engineering equipment, and everything else that makes an army real. So when people ask whether Putin is losing control, that is the right lens to use. Not whether every last truck in Russia is stopped, not whether one headline number is perfectly documented. The question is whether the Kremlin still controls the tempo of movement across the systems that matter most. And here, the signs are growing darker. Because tempo is exactly what Ukraine is attacking. Slow the refineries, slow the roads, slow the truck fleet, slow risky routes into Crimea and occupied territories, slow the farming season, slow the rail-connected freight network, force Moscow to spend more, improvise more, and explain more. That is not one strike. That is a strategy. And strategies matter most when they create hard choices. Russia cannot give every region top priority at once. If more fuel is diverted to agriculture, something else gets less. If the military gets first claim, civilian anger grows. If rail-linked freight is protected, road operators suffer. Scarcity is political because every solution creates a loser somewhere else. That is what makes this moment so sensitive. A strong state projects abundance. It tells people there's enough for everyone, enough for war, enough for trade, enough for daily life. A state under strain starts rationing quietly, shifting supply quietly, explaining quietly. And eventually the public notices that quiet management is just another word for shortage. The symbolic damage is as serious as the material damage. Russia built much of its wartime image on endurance. The message was simple. Sanctions will fail. Pressure will fail. Industry will adapt. Society will absorb the pain. But fuel lines and freight disruption hit that message at street level. They make the cost visible in a way statistics cannot. That visibility changes politics, even if it does not cause immediate unrest. A man stuck in traffic near a pump may not protest. A farmer may not speak publicly. A trucker may still take the route if the pay is high enough. But each of them carries the same quiet conclusion home. Things are getting harder. Things are less normal. And once enough citizens reach that conclusion, the state has a narrative problem. Official television can talk about resilience all night long, but a shortage in front of your own eyes argues louder than a studio host ever can. That is why these scenes matter so much. They are not merely inconvenient, they are persuasive. Still, it is important to keep the picture honest. Russia has not become a motionless ruin. Freight still moves, trade with China still matters. Industrial output has not vanished overnight. Many routes remain open. The system is under heavy stress, but it is not a single total collapse in the most theatrical sense of the phrase. But then again, systems rarely die in one loud instant. They weaken in layers. They absorb shock until one more disruption turns a manageable problem into a chain reaction. That is the risk facing Moscow now. Not necessarily immediate nationwide standstill, but a prolonged erosion of reliability across enough key sectors that recovery becomes harder with every passing month. That is especially true if refinery repairs cannot outrun new attacks. A facility can be restored. Engineers can replace damaged units. Crews can work around the clock. But if drones keep coming, repairs become a race against the next strike. And in that kind of contest, even partial damage repeated often enough can grind down national capacity. Winter is the shadow hanging over all of this. Summer shortages are bad enough. Winter shortages are political dynamite. Cold weather increases transport strain, energy demand, and public anxiety. If refining issues and logistics pressure continue deep into the colder months, every delay becomes more dangerous. The margin for error gets much smaller. This is why the current crisis cannot be dismissed as a bad few weeks. It may be the opening phase of a much larger contest over endurance. Can Russia restore fuel stability faster than Ukraine can disrupt it? Can it protect critical routes without overcommitting resources? Can it keep both civilian life and military operations supplied without visible sacrifice? Those are not easy questions. And the most telling sign is that the Kremlin itself appears to understand the danger. Once top leadership begins openly addressing domestic shortages, it signals that the issue has crossed from local complaint to national concern. Leaders do not highlight weakness in wartime unless the weakness has become impossible to hide. There's also a morale dimension here. Ukraine's strikes do more than damage metal and pipelines. They send a message into Russia itself. They say that distance no longer guarantees safety, that a war launched outward can return inward through infrastructure, that the homeland can be reached not by invading armies but by repeated pressure against what keeps normal life alive. That message lands hard because it cuts against years of official framing. Russians were told the state remained in command, that pressure from outside would be managed, and that daily life would continue with limited disruption. Fuel queues near major cities challenge that story directly. They replace confidence with doubt, and doubt is contagious. For Ukraine, that is part of the logic. A drone that strikes a refinery may not change one frontline trench overnight. But if it helps reduce output, raises costs, creates queues, and forces Moscow into awkward public admissions, it contributes to a broader campaign, not just territorial warfare, but strategic exhaustion. Wear down the machine behind the army. And for Moscow, that means every answer becomes expensive. More air defense for refineries, more route security, more repair work, more hazard pay, more supply prioritization, more political messaging, more pressure on regional officials to solve problems they cannot fully solve. A war of attrition is no longer confined to the battlefield. It is biting into administration itself. The title promise of this story is not really about one dramatic snapshot. It is about loss of command over a national rhythm. When fuel supply becomes uncertain, movement loses rhythm. When movement loses rhythm, commerce loses rhythm. When commerce loses rhythm, confidence disappears. That is how power begins to look less solid than it did before. And that is why the image of 150,000 trucks resonated so strongly. It captured, in one brutal phrase, the feeling of a network under strain. Even if the exact number remains disputed, the deeper truth is that enough routes, drivers, businesses, and supply chains are being disrupted that the idea no longer sounds impossible. That alone is alarming. What makes this even more striking is that Russia is not facing only one enemy action. It is facing compounded pressure. Refineries are being hit, freight corridors are being hunted, fuel distribution is being strained, storage reserves are being tested, civilian demand is reacting, seasonal agricultural needs are colliding with military ones. The overlap is the danger. Any one of those problems might be manageable alone. Together, they begin to behave like a trap. Solve one and another tightens. Push more fuel toward cities and the farms suffer. Protect one route and the enemy shifts to another. Spend more on repairs and other sectors wait longer. Scarcity keeps moving around the board. That is why some Russian-occupied areas have looked especially vulnerable. Places that depend on a few exposed corridors or contested links can feel the crisis first and hardest. There, the shortage is not theoretical. It reaches tourism, food deliveries, civilian transport, and military movement all at once. A region built on fragile access quickly becomes a stress test. Crimea has served as one of the clearest examples of that vulnerability. Once fuel access tightens and supply routes face repeated pressure, every problem becomes linked. Visitors think twice. Local businesses lose confidence. Authorities grow more restrictive. And military logistics compete with ordinary civilian needs in a way that exposes the limits of control. This matters symbolically because Crimea was supposed to represent permanence, stability, ownership, proof that Russia could seize territory and fold it into a normal system of roads, trade, and daily life. But a territory that depends on risky roads and uncertain fuel does not look stable. It looks expensive to hold. And that may be one of the biggest shifts of all. Ukraine is not only trying to make Russian advances costly, it is trying to make Russian possession costly, to turn every kilometer of occupied territory into a recurring burden on fuel, transport, and risk management. The land may still be held, but holding it becomes harder. That pressure also exposes the hidden dependence of modern warfare on civilian systems. Armies do not operate in a vacuum. They draw from the same national fuel pools, road networks, maintenance crews, and transport ecosystems that serve the broader economy. Damage the base, the military begins absorbing consequences even if frontline maps do not change immediately. This is where the current campaign feels different from earlier phases of the war. It is more distributed, more patient, less about one famous battle and more about constant attrition behind the scenes. A truck burned on a route, a tanker lost, a refinery offline, a queue outside a station, a night wasted waiting for diesel. On their own, those images seem separate. Together, they form a picture of pressure spreading through the state's connective tissue. That is why the story is so compelling. Not because it offers one neat collapse moment, but because it shows how a powerful country can be made to feel clumsy, reactive, and strained. And ordinary Russians are not blind to that. They do not need access to military planning rooms to understand what is happening. They can see the lines. They can watch prices move. They can hear from relatives in farming regions. They can read local channels and business complaints. Piece by piece, the same conclusion starts forming. The system is wobbling. That wobble does not automatically produce a political breaking point. Russia has absorbed pain before. It has endured sanctions, losses, and long stretches of grim adaptation. But endurance is not the same thing as control. A country can keep functioning while still losing grip over the smooth operation of key systems. That seems to be the zone Moscow is entering. The next few months will tell us whether this becomes a temporary shock or something more lasting. Watch refinery repair timelines. Watch whether export restrictions continue. Watch reports from agriculture. Watch freight tariffs and delivery times. Watch whether more old vehicles are pulled from storage. And above all, watch whether the pressure moves from inconvenience into open rationing. Because open rationing is a different political world. It tells the population the shortage is not a rumor and not a passing glitch. It tells them supply must now be managed visibly. Once that threshold is crossed, every speech by officials sounds weaker. Every promise of stability has to compete with daily proof to the contrary. And that brings us back to Putin. The core question is not whether he personally controls each pump, truck, and rail spur. The question is whether his system still commands enough surplus, enough flexibility, and enough confidence to absorb this kind of layered attack without showing strain. Right now, it is showing strain. The war has reached into the ordinary mechanics of Russian life. That is the breakthrough Ukraine has been chasing. A war fought with long-range strikes and drone hunting teams is now shaping the mood inside fuel lines and freight depots far from the trenches. It is shrinking the psychological distance between battlefield and home front. For a long time, Moscow relied on that distance. The idea that fighting could stay there while normal life stayed here. But fuel shortages break that illusion. They translate war into something drivers, farmers, shop owners, and local officials can feel in their schedules, budgets, and tempers. Once that translation happens, war becomes much harder to quarantine. And when war can no longer be quarantined, leadership faces a choice. Admit more and risk looking weak. Deny more and risk looking absurd. Shift supply and anger some regions. Protect exports and anger domestic consumers. Prioritize the military and squeeze civilians. Prioritize civilians and risk operational strain. None of those choices is painless. That is why this crisis deserves so much attention. It is not just about long lines at a station or dramatic footage from one road. It is about a state being forced into trade-offs that reveal its limits. And once limits are visible, the image of total control begins to crack. Maybe that is the real meaning behind the phrase Putin loses control. Not that the entire machine has stopped, not that Russia has suddenly become helpless, but that events are increasingly setting the pace while the Kremlin reacts. The war is imposing costs in places Moscow did not want to discuss, and the discussion has now become unavoidable. If refinery outages continue, if truck losses stay high, if risky corridors keep scaring drivers away, and if seasonal demand rises again before supply fully recovers, this crisis could deepen in ways that are far more serious than what we have seen so far. The current strain may only be the warning shot. For now, the strongest conclusion is also the simplest one. Russia is not facing a single clean collapse. It is facing a spreading logistics crisis with civilian and military faces at the same time. Fuel pressure, transport friction, and battlefield attrition are feeding each other. That makes the whole picture more dangerous than any one headline can capture. And it explains why a woman near St. Petersburg trapped in a line with an empty tank matters so much. She is not just one driver having a bad day. She is a glimpse of what strategic pressure looks like when it reaches everyday life. That is when a war stops feeling distant. The same is true of the farmer waiting for diesel before dawn, the trucker demanding triple pay to take a risky route, the rail operator staring at a fuel bill that suddenly makes normal business impossible, the official who must explain why a major oil state cannot keep pumps reliably full. These are not isolated stories anymore. They are pieces of one larger shift, a shift in which movement itself has become contested. A shift in which fuel is no longer just a commodity, but a weaponized pressure point. A shift in which the cost of continuing the war is being measured not only at the front, but in the everyday mechanics of national life. If you have been hearing big claims about trucks frozen across Russia, this is what sits underneath the noise. The exact number matters less than the pattern, and the pattern is unmistakable. Roads are riskier, fuel is tighter, costs are rising, confidence is thinning. Control looks less automatic than it did before. That is why this story is not ending soon. It is still unfolding. The next refinery strike, the next harvest delay, the next restricted route, the next week of vehicle losses could all push the picture further. If you think Moscow has already seen the worst, the coming months may prove otherwise. And if you think this is just another wartime inconvenience, look again. In modern war, breaking a nation's rhythm can matter as much as breaking a line on the map. Right now, Russia's rhythm is being tested in public, and the more that rhythm falters, the harder it becomes to pretend nothing fundamental has changed. So when people ask what mass collapse really looks like, it may not begin with one spectacular final image. It may begin with a fuel gauge dropping toward empty, a road no one wants to drive, and a country discovering that even in an oil empire, motion can no longer be taken for granted. If you think Moscow can still stabilize this, say so. If you think the strain only gets worse from here, say that too. Because the fight over fuel, roads, and logistics may decide more than the next battle. It may decide how long Russia can keep this war moving at all. And that is the deepest danger for the Kremlin. Once a state starts struggling to move what it needs, where it needs it, when it needs it, power stops looking absolute. It starts looking conditional. It starts looking expensive. It starts looking vulnerable. And in war, that change can alter everything.